Hi everyone. So today we're going to be going over part 2 of chapter 23, the respiratory system. In part 1 we went over basic anatomy terminology and function of respiratory tract structures. And then what we're going to be doing in this lecture is going over the 4 distinct processes of breathing. And so that's going to include pulmonary ventilation, external and internal respiration, as well as gas transport. After we go over that, we're going to discuss various laws of respiration, which include Boyle's laws, Dalton's laws, and Henry's laws. And then the last part, we'll talk about factors that affect the affinity of oxygen for hemoglobin, transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide through the cardiovascular system. And then throughout the lecture, we'll also cover any clinical applications. On this slide, we're focusing on the muscles that facilitate the breathing process. Now, the 2 muscles that play a role in normal quiet inhalation are going to be the diaphragm, which is a dome-shaped muscle located here, and that's going to separate the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. Now, the diaphragm alone is responsible for facilitating 75% of the air that enters your lungs during inhalation. So this is going to be the major muscle of inhalation. The second muscle that plays a role in inhalation is going to be the external intercostal muscles, which are located between the ribs. When these muscles contract, that is going to help elevate the ribs sort of in this direction to expand it, and that's also going to facilitate air entering the lungs. Now, there are some minor accessory muscles also involved in inhalation, and those are the sternocleidomastoid and the scalene muscles. These are going to play more of a role, let's say if someone is gasping for air, that's when they will contract and allow for even more air to enter the lungs. Now, the muscles of exhalation are going to be the internal intercostals. When the external intercostals relax and the internal intercostals contract, they're going to play a role in pulling on the ribs to help depress the lungs down. Another thing that's going to occur is going to be relaxation of the diaphragm. So actually during inhalation, the diaphragm normally is going to be in this dome-shaped position. When it contracts, it goes to being flat like that, and that helps increase the volume of the thoracic cavity. And then in exhalation, the diaphragm is going to relax and go back to being dome-shaped. So contraction, flat, relaxation, dome-shaped. And it's constantly oscillating between those 2 positions. Now, abdominal muscles, when they contract, that's going to help facilitate forceful expulsion of air. And that's actually something that you practice during the laboratory exercise. Here we're looking at a summary of breathing. Now, a couple of pressures that you need to keep in mind are going to be the pressures inside the lungs here. And there's 2 terms for that. There's alveolar pressure, or it's also called intrapulmonary pressure. So you can see it written either way. Another pressure is going to be the pressure outside of the body. That is called atmospheric pressure. And atmospheric pressure at sea level is 760 millimeters per mercury. Intrapulmonary or alveolar pressure at rest is going to be equal to atmospheric pressure. So that's going to be when there is no exchange of air between the atmosphere and the lungs. However, during inhalation, also called inspiration, remember that the diaphragm is going to contract and the external intercostals are going to elevate the rib cage. When that happens, the volume of the thoracic cavity and the volume inside the lungs is going to increase. Boyle's law says that there's an inverse relationship between the volume of a container and the pressure of a gas. So during inhalation, if the volume of the rib cage increases, alveolar pressure is going to decrease. Now, what does that ultimately mean in terms of air? You know that air goes from outside the environment into the lungs. And the main reason for that is going to be because alveolar pressure is now lower than atmospheric pressure, so air goes in. Okay, now during exhalation, which is also called expiration, the diaphragm, which was flattened when it contracts, is now going to relax, going back to being a dome shape. and the external intercostals relax, and now the internal intercostal muscles are going to contract. When they contract, that is going to help pull on the lungs this way to depress the ribs. To depress the ribs, ultimately the volume of the rib cage is now going to decrease, which increases pressure inside the lungs, and that pressure exceeds atmospheric pressure. So now alveolar pressure is 762 millimeters of mercury, and air is going to go from a higher pressure to a lower pressure, so it goes out of the lungs. And then when you breathe, it simply is going to continue this process back and forth. So far in part 2 of chapter 23, we have talked about pulmonary ventilation, which is going to be the movement of air into and out of the lungs. Pretty much for the rest of the chapter, now we're going to be focusing on the processes of external and internal respiration. And that requires the movement of gases, primarily oxygen and carbon dioxide, between blood and the capillaries and the body's cells or tissues. Now, when we talk about air, there's actually more than just oxygen and CO2 in air. There's other gases, and these gases include nitrogen, water, and then some other minor gases. Now, keep in mind that atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. Well, if you look at all of the individual pressures that each gas exerts, these are called partial pressures, and it's noted as capital P, subscript, and then whatever gas we're talking about. They have their own pressure. When you combine all of the individual pressures, voila, that equals 760 millimeters of mercury. So we are going to be focusing on the partial pressures of oxygen and CO2, and it's the partial pressures of these gases that is now going to be the primary driving force that causes the exchange of gases between blood and tissues. This slide is focusing on the process of external respiration, which is also called alveolar gas exchange. All right, so a concept to keep in mind is going to be the movement of gases, and we're focusing on oxygen and CO2, carbon dioxide. Now, just like diffusion, gases are also going to go from high to low partial pressure, which is just like during diffusion, solutes are going to go down their concentration gradient. Now, in pink, you're seeing the partial pressure of oxygen, and in blue is going to be the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So what are we looking at? We're looking at the microscopic features of a lung lobule. Here we have an alveolus, we have the respiratory membrane, and then we have the pulmonary capillaries. Now, in the lungs, recall this is when blood is going to pick up oxygen in exchange for CO2. Now, you know that oxygen goes from the lung into blood, but why? The reason for that is because of the difference in partial pressure of oxygen. Partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus is higher, 104 millimeters of mercury, than it is inside the blood of the capillaries. So oxygen is going from 104 to 40 millimeters of mercury. It goes down its concentration gradient and ultimately moves into blood. Now, what you're actually seeing here versus here is going to be the partial pressure of oxygen as it arrives in the capillaries of the lungs. It moves through the lungs picking up oxygen, and it picks up oxygen until it reaches equilibrium. So now the partial pressures are equal at 104 millimeters of mercury. Now, if you're feeling confused, all you need to keep in mind is that oxygen goes into blood because it is going down its partial pressure gradient. It's that simple. So if blood is picking up oxygen, it's going to be giving off CO2. Well, why does it give off CO2? Again, because of differences in partial pressure of that gas. It's going to go from a higher partial pressure in blood to a lower partial pressure in the air of the alveolus. When it enters the lung, the partial pressure is higher, CO2 leaves, and it stops exchanging once blood reaches, or the partial pressure of oxygen in blood is equal between the air and blood. So that's it. If you get confused, do you have to memorize all these numbers? I've always told you no, but the movement of gases is based on that difference in partial pressure, and it's always going to go from a higher pressure to a lower partial pressure. Here we're looking at internal respiration, which is also called systemic gas exchange. Now, in the lungs, when blood picked up oxygen and gave off CO2, the cardiovascular system is going to transport those gases to the various bodies, tissues, and cells. Now, you know that when blood arrives to the systemic capillaries, oxygen is going to get delivered to the tissue cells. Now, oxygen is used for cellular respiration, and a byproduct of cellular respiration is carbon dioxide. So as cells build up CO2 levels, it's going to get dumped off into blood for transport back to the lungs where it gets exhaled back into the environment. So again, we're looking at the exchange of two gases, oxygen and CO2. What's going to drive the movement of those gases? Differences in partial pressure between blood and the tissue cells. And again, the gases are going to go from a higher partial pressure to a lower partial pressure. Again, it's that simple. So when blood arrives in the systemic capillaries, partial pressure of oxygen is higher in blood and lower in the cells. So oxygen goes into the cells. If you look at the partial pressure of CO2, it is lower in blood and higher in the cells. So CO2 goes from the cells into blood. So again, it's that simple. But as a last note, I want to go ahead and mention this bullet point right here. So you know that oxygen is delivered to tissue cells. And just to briefly remind you that every molecule of hemoglobin, which is the protein in blood, can carry up to 4 molecules of oxygen. So when oxygen is actually being delivered to the tissue cells, it's actually only one of those oxygen molecules that is being delivered or unloaded from the blood into tissues. Now, that being said, we always say that blood is now deoxygenated, which is true. But keep in mind, though it is deoxygenated, hemoglobin is still carrying 3 of those 4 molecules of oxygen. So it still has 75% of its oxygen capacity. And we'll come back to that point in another slide. Now this is a pretty busy slide, so let me break it down for you. We are going to focus on how oxygen is transported in the blood. So there's 2 ways that oxygen is transported in blood. The majority of oxygen is going to be bound to iron molecule on hemoglobin. There is a small percentage of oxygen that dissolves in plasma, but very little. So for the most part, we focus on oxygen transport attached to hemoglobin. Okay. And then also, as a reminder, for every hemoglobin, it can bind up to 4 oxygen molecules. Now, in order for oxygen to actually detach from hemoglobin, there's going to be different factors that affect its dissociation, which we'll talk about in a future slide. Now, this here is looking at the saturation curve for hemoglobin as it goes through different parts of the body. So you're looking at partial pressure on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis, you're looking at percent saturation of hemoglobin. So to keep this very simple, think about when blood leaves the lungs, it is 100% saturated. And then over here, you're looking at the partial pressure. As it goes through the arteries to the various tissues, and let's say when it delivers 1 oxygen molecule, it is now 75% saturated, though it is called deoxygenated at that point. And then blood goes back to the lungs, picks up another oxygen molecule, goes back to being oxygenated. Now that's at rest. What if there's an increase in the metabolic demands for the body, such as exercising or running or something like that? The cells need more oxygen. And luckily, blood cells have a reserve of oxygen because they are still 75% saturated. So let's say they go through skeletal muscle, which needs more oxygen. That is going to be delivered to those tissue cells. And then when they leave, it is now somewhere around 35% saturation. So really that is all we're focusing here on the saturation curve. It is just showing you the relationship to the saturation of hemoglobin, and also showing you how partial pressures are going to help be a driving force for the unloading of oxygen. Now we're going to focus on the transport of carbon dioxide. Now, unlike oxygen, carbon dioxide can be carried 3 different ways in blood. It can be dissolved in blood plasma, of which 7% of carbon dioxide is transported that way. It can be combined or physically attached to hemoglobin, of which that makes up 23%. Hemoglobin attached to carbon dioxide is now called carbaminohemoglobin, but the majority of carbon dioxide is going to be transported as part of the bicarbonate ion. That's going to make up 70% of CO2 transport in blood. Now when CO2 is transported in blood, and most of it is as bicarbonate, CO2 is actually going to combine with water present in blood plasma. When this happens, it forms carbonic acid, which is unstable, and it immediately dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. So this is how CO2 is going to be transported in blood, at least 70% anyways. So the fact that CO2 forms carbonic acid and dissociates, anytime CO2 enters the blood, keep in mind this is going to affect blood pH because of the production and liberation of hydrogen ions. Now this is actually a very useful buffer system present in blood, and this is a reversible reaction which is important. So as the pH in blood changes, it can drive the reaction in either direction to help temporarily buffer changes in pH. And so this is called the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, and it is facilitated by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. And the main thing here to keep in mind as the function of it is to resist changes in blood pH. Now, as carbon dioxide is moving into and out of blood, it's producing bicarbonate. If bicarbonate accumulates in blood, it's going to diffuse out of blood. Now look at the charge of bicarbonate. It has a negative charge. Now the red blood cell has an overall positive charge, but it wants to stay neutral. So there's something called the chloride shift, and it depends on the movement of bicarbonate into and out of the blood cell, which is a direct reflection of the movement of CO2. Now, if bicarbonate builds up and diffuses out of the cell, what's going to happen to even out the charge in the red blood cell is now chloride is going to move into the cell to balance that loss of the negatively charged bicarbonate. Alternatively, what's not shown in this picture but in the next slide is that if bicarbonate instead enters the cell, now you gain a negative charge in the red blood cell. So to balance that out, there's going to be a loss of chloride out of the red blood cell to even out that negative charge from bicarbonate that enters the red blood cell. So here we're taking a look at the chloride shift, which is going to be the movement of chloride ions into and out of the red blood cell. And this is always very confusing to students when I teach it, so it's actually very simple. Again, so let's keep it simple. In systemic capillaries, we have CO2 being picked up by the red blood cells. CO2 enters, you have the bicarbonate buffer system. Ultimately, it's going to liberate bicarbonate ions. As bicarbonate accumulates, it leaves the cell and chloride moves in to balance that charge. Okay, so how do we keep it simple? If CO2 enters the cell, chloride enters the cell. Now in pulmonary capillaries, we have CO2 that goes from red blood cells into the lungs. So if we reverse that bicarbonate carbonic acid buffer system, it actually starts with the movement of bicarbonate into the red blood cell. That reaction goes in the reverse direction, CO2 accumulates, it leaves the red blood cell. So if CO2 is leaving the red blood cell, guess what? Chloride is also leaving the red blood cell. So just keep it that simple, don't overthink it, don't make it more complicated than it has to be.